So last time, I was talking about what makes pure mathematics possible and all those kind of things. But again, I kind of want to begin by stepping back a moment and making sure we got the big picture of things, right? And of course, last time we made the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments. Make sure I hit the record button there. I sometimes forget to do that. So, and we formulated the question that we're going to call like the main question of Kant's Prolegomena, which is, right, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? How are synthetic judgments a priori possible? Now, going back to what we were talking about last time, what is a synthetic judgment a priori? Like, what does that mean? Let's just break it down for a moment. First, as a recap or review, we know that synthetic judgments, or excuse me, analytic and synthetic judgments. What is an analytic judgment? It is where the predicate is contained within the concept, right? It is a judgment that is purely definitional, like all bachelors are unmarried, right? So, again, gold is the yellow metal. That is an analytic judgment because it's a judgment that doesn't go beyond the definition or the notion, right? It's purely definitional. It's purely conceptual, okay? Synthetic, so that's why analytic judgments equal a priori, right? So analytic is a definitional judgment. Synthetic, at least as we typically think about it, is a posteriori. And again, a quick reminder, what is a priori again? Prior to experience, very good. So a posteriori means after or within experience, right? So, again, analytic, no knowledge is gained, right? It is only, Kant's word is explicated, aka analyzed, right? So, what is gold? Well, to make a judgment about that, we just have to only look at the concept and explicate it. It's a yellow metal. What is a bachelor? An unmarried man, right? So I guess we can say all bachelors are unmarried. Yes, we can, because that's implied in the concept of bachelor. Okay, fine. These are judgments we usually relate to experience, because knowledge is amplified, to use Kant's word. So again, just mapping onto the language that he uses in the reading, right? Analytic judgments explicated, synthetic judgments amplified, which is basically saying knowledge is amplified. It means knowledge is gained or expanded. Okay? It makes sense that analytic is a priori. It makes sense that judgments of experience are both, synthetic and a posteriori, right? Because it's another way of saying, empirical versus non-empirical. It makes sense to say analytic judgments will not be a posteriori. But what about the possibility of synthetic judgments a priori? In the heart of this question, there's two sides to it, okay? Kant is ultimately sort of pointing out, number one, the first thing that should come to mind when we think about the amplification or expansion of knowledge prior to any experience is, of course, rationalism, right? Now, it should already be clear, based upon some of the things that I've said, that, Kant's critique of pure reason, right, is going to be a critique of metaphysics. So he's asking the question, is it possible to amplify or expand our knowledge prior to experience? It's like asking about the possibility of metaphysics. Of course, metaphysics ends up being only the last question that Kant ends up asking. Is metaphysics at all possible? The conclusion is not really. But we have to motivate that conclusion. See, Kant's work is sort of like a long arc of trying to establish the answer to this. But in developing his critique and rejection of metaphysical philosophy, he's giving us a new picture of mind and how it works and reality, namely this Copernican turn that I was stressing last time and the time before. Right? So he breaks this question down, again, into more ways, because normally we would associate the amplification of knowledge prior to experience with the question of metaphysics, right? Because when we talk about metaphysics, we're talking about things like God, soul, freedom, immortality, all that stuff that metaphysicians want to seek after, right? But Kant actually flips the script, which, as you can tell, is kind of like something we do, and says, in fact, there are many instances where we make conclusions about, fundamental areas of human knowledge. And it draws from non-empirical sources. It draws our conclusions about certain things, draw from non-empirical sources that are a priori. A priori, in its strictest sense, again, just means prior to experience. Now, again, that doesn't necessarily only connote these, spiritual metaphysical entities, right, or things that exist outside of this realm, but it can also refer to things that exist within the mind prior to experience. So rather than thinking about it purely in relation to metaphysics, Kant says, what other domains of human thought draw from non-empirical cognition, aka synthetic judgments a priori, draw from sources that are prior to or not located within experience. When Kant is talking about the a priori element of pure natural science and pure mathematics, he's referring to not anything mystical and strange outside of human experience. Rather, he's referring to what are the aspects of our judgments, or what aspects of the judgments that we make about mathematics and science draw from a priori or non-empirical, non-external sources, aka human mental intuitions or mental concepts and categories that exist only within the mind. How is that possible? That is what Kant is ultimately talking about. So again, just to be clear, synthetic judgments a priori, straightforward, literally means to the amplification of knowledge prior to experience, not a posteriori, but a priori, right? So how is knowledge amplified, again, prior to experience? And Kant tries to justify that mathematical judgments and judgments about natural science depend upon some form of a priori cognition, aka they draw their conclusions, at least in part, from some non-empirical source, or a source that doesn't come from sensation, right? And that is what's motivating Kant's entire argument here, okay? We've already answered the pure mathematics question, but I kind of want to, again, go back just for clarity, right? Kant is trying to make the case that mathematics has a non-empirical element, or, to put it another way, that knowledge can be amplified without the aid of experience. And again, he talks about 7 plus 5 equals 12. But let me also, before I talk about this, add to this as well. Remember, What Kant is speaking against in regard to mathematics, and by the way, in the philosophy of mathematics, mathematicians do talk about these things, and these debates are sort of in part inspired by Kant and Hume and these earlier philosophers that talked about them. What is the nature of mathematics? Kind of an interesting question. Like, what is it really? What Hume seemed to argue for and presuppose, and he's not alone. Rationalist philosophers even argued this before Hume. We didn't study him, but Leibniz basically agreed with Hume in principle on the nature of mathematics. And for Hume, the nature of mathematics is fundamentally, it would be analogous to Kant's analytic judgments, because he called, remember, the propositions of mathematics and logic relations of ideas. AKA, what mathematics is to Hume, the reality of mathematics is basically nothing more than, we all have we agree, all of us, upon these universal definitions of things like, integer and certain numbers and like addition and subtraction and all of these kind of things. And we agree, like, this is a triangle, this is a square, this is what a polygon is, and based upon this like conceptual understanding, shared understanding of these definitions, it ultimately just ends up being a kind of a game, like, relating definitions and concepts to one another. But its reality or its justification is entirely internal to itself, based upon the definitions and the concepts that make mathematics possible. So, like, for example, the principle of contradiction. The definitions of mathematics and its rules, because to imply that they would be otherwise would just be a fundamental manifest contradiction, right? But of course, what does that imply about mathematics? It's all just a human creation. But let me say this. Isn't it interesting that, even though like mathematics may appear at first glance to really have kind of an analytical element, and we might be persuaded with Hume's reasoning, isn't it odd that mathematics conforms so well and so perfectly to all the objects of our experience? Every physical thing, and Plato mentioned this, by the way, every physical thing is quantifiable mathematically, quantitatively. Of course, that's part of the essence of the Cartesian mechanistic worldview, that mathematics is the way to comprehend the nature of the universe, because the very essence of things themselves are mathematical, right? So if mathematics was just made up, why does it seem to be exhibited and manifest within the very objects of nature themselves? So there is an essence of mathematics that may transcend merely definitional, because here's the important thing to consider with this. Yes, bachelors exist, and men exist, and marriage exists. But the proposition, all bachelors are unmarried, doesn't require the existence of any of those kind of things, because the truth of that claim is only one that is. Maybe here's a better example. All vampires are bloodsuckers. Why is that true? Right. And it's part of what we understand conceptually as what makes a vampire a vampire. Is it relevant that I'm pretty darn certain, Twilight and Bram Stoker aside, that there's no such thing as vampires? We can all agree on that one, right? Is it relevant that there's no such thing as vampires? Of course not, because the truth of that concept is based upon only the definition of vampire, which is something that I made up. But mathematics, according to Kant, because of the way in which it literally seems to manifest itself, like in the world in which we perceive, and his much more simple example, that 12 is not contained analytically in 5 and 7 in the same way that like unmarriedness or bloodsucker is found in bachelorhood or vampire, respectively. 12 is not in 7, it's not in 5, but unmarriedness is within the notion of bachelorhood, conceptually, right? So that means this integer is fundamentally distinct from its components. And so, thus, is not an analysis of previous concepts, but is synthetic, aka knowledge has been gained without mere analysis. Rather, it's been amplified without the means of experience. How is this possible? Okay. So mathematics seems to have as its basis some kind of non-empirical element. And again, Kant's argument here, and the reason I'm stressing this is so you can kind of see the motivation of Kant's analysis and how he's thinking about things differently from Hume, right? Is that, look, there is human cognition. Despite what, for example, empiricists like Hume might claim, there are examples of human cognition that go beyond the realm of experience. And we're not talking about metaphysics here. We're talking about everyday reason, right? How is this possible? And it's Kant's analysis that motivates his whole theory here. Now, also in the background, I haven't talked about it yet, but I just want to remind you, what's also part of the background here, we're going to be responding to Hume's problem. Okay, and I hope by the end of class to return to that question. And just kind of keep that in the background. I realize that one of the things that makes Kant tough is that there's a lot of moving parts. You know, there's a lot going on. It's a very systematic philosophy, but just try not to lose sight of the forest for the trees, okay? All right, so in order to answer the question of how it is possible, how is pure mathematics possible, Kant turns to an analysis of the nature of the mind itself. Okay, so let's call these, capacities of the rational mind. I don't know that it's very important. Sometimes I'll use the word capacity, sometimes faculty, but just think about, the way that the mind operates. There are three basic categories of mental capacity for Kant. Okay? We're going to have sensibility, the understanding, and finally reason. Each mental capacity is going to correspond to one of these questions. Each one of these questions corresponds to the three respective parts of the Prolegomena. So you can kind of see it as Kant is breaking this fundamental question, the possibility of the expansion of knowledge prior to experience, which is, he thinks, the fundamental question that is the future of possible metaphysics, in the three domains of human cognition. And each domain is going to amount to an analysis of a different capacity of the rational mind. And the conclusion, after outlining the way in which knowledge is possible in various areas for humanity, will return to the critique of pure reason, his death blow to metaphysics. So it's a very systematic approach. And I just kind of want to warn you, I feel like I do these graphs sometimes, and I feel like students are tempted to latch too much onto the graph. If I just can memorize the graph, I can get Kant. Remember, this is just my schema for illustrating Kant's argument. It is not Kant itself is the graph. It is a way, I'm hoping, to organize and make sense of Kant. So I'll see some people, like in the essay for the final, they'll just draw a little chart there, and I'm just kind of like, well, that's a nice chart. I like a good chart because that is my chart. But you got to explain it and wrap your head around it. And I really do feel like that's part of the hard thing about philosophy generally, not just Kant, but generally this semester, just getting your head wrapped around some of these big arguments, and maybe what's even harder, articulating that into words. So, that's just something, you got to think about. But anyway, so in an effort to understand the possibility of synthetic judgments a priori, aka the expansion of our knowledge prior to any experience, Kant, again, points to mathematics. That's how it's possible. He said, well, we're just going to have to begin with an analysis of what really for him is like the most basic faculty or capacity of mind, sensibility. It is necessarily through which objects are given. it can be a little bit tough sometimes to wrap your head on exactly what, how Kant's understanding things for us, or putting things, and in a probably entirely unhelpful way. I'm going to draw from Kant's critique, where he basically sort of talks about this, what I'm outlining here. And Kant says there, our cognition. What is cognition? Cognition is a big one. Just, our capacity to know about things, our thinking about things. So when we cognize something, we think about something, right? It's activity of the mind. Our cognition arises from two fundamental sources in the mind. The first of which is the reception of representations, the receptivity of impressions. The second is the faculty for cognizing an object by means of these representations, the spontaneity of concepts. Through the former, an object is given to us. Through the latter, it is thought in relation to that representation as a mere determination of the mind. Intuitions and concepts therefore constitute all the elements of our cognition, so that neither concepts without intuition corresponding to them in some way, nor intuition without concepts can yield a cognition. Both are either pure or empirical. Empirical if sensation, which presupposes the actual presence of the object, is contained therein, but pure if no sensation is mixed into the representation. One can call the latter the matter of sensible cognition. Thus, pure intuition contains merely the form under which something is intuited, and pure concept only the form of thinking of an object in general. Only pure intuitions or concepts alone are possible a priori. Empirical ones are always a posteriori. Okay? If you followed any of that, good. As we can see, Kant is very abstract. He outlined these two basic mental faculties. Sensibility, which is what he's dealing with in part one in relation to the mathematics question, is through which objects are given to us. What's the best analogy that I can give here? We sense things, but Kant is breaking down this experience, the mental phenomena of the capacity for sensation, in a kind of a rational way. He's basically saying that when we sense, we are taking in data. The form that all data is taken in, the way that that data is given to us, is in what he's calling intuition. Okay? So again, that is an important technical term for Kant. It literally refers to the way that objects are given to us. Okay? The way in which objects are present to the mind. But importantly, as he illustrates here, it comes in two forms. Empirical empirical. Kant's a good example as to why, terminology, like the terms and concept stuff that I stress on exams early on is important, because by now you should already know what empirical means. But let me go ahead and ask, well, both of you, a lot of pressure when you're the only students in the class. What does empirical mean? I appreciate your trying, but that is not wrong. But that's why I'm glad you tried, because I want to make it clear. It's not related to empires or imperialism. Just go back to what you know. We have rationalists and we have empiricists. Think about the pure people as the rationalist people, because what irrationalists not like, they don't like. True. I appreciate your trying. Thank you so much. Rationalism is a theory of knowledge that says that knowledge does not come from sensation. There you go. There, you just had to jog the memory a little bit, And their counterpart, their nemesis, are the empiricists, exemplified by David Hume. And Hume said that all knowledge only comes from sensation. So anytime we're using this word empirical, we're referring to objects only of sensation. Yeah, so that which is empirical is sensible. That's why the faculty is called sensibility, because it refers to the way that we take in sense data. Empirical intuition are akin to Humean impressions. Blue, right? Not by notion of blue, but the immediacy of blue, like the impression I'm getting at that moment, right? In its raw sensual form, right? Feeling, the warmth of a blue blanket, which I can also tell is soft, and everything is going really well until I take a drink of really bitter coffee. Ruin my comfy moment in my warm blue blanket. That is also soft, right? But again, it's immediate sensory data. And again, so Kant's asking, a question that seems simple, but he's obviously trying to really work through this. How do we take in the world? We take in the world through sense data. So what he's suggesting is, based upon that information, if we're understanding, the mind as that which represents the world to us, and you can kind of see how the foundations of Kant's theory lie in Cartesian representationalism, right? And again, what was representationalism? That we don't directly apprehend the world outside of us, but we see it as an idea or a representation. Kant is offering something, not the exact same thing, but it's very clear that he's informed by, influenced by that worldview. That there's this distinction between, let's call it my conscious representation of the thing and the thing itself. Okay? So there's a fundamental distinction between representation and, let's call it, mind-independent reality. You with me so far? So how do we represent this world to ourselves? Well, we can't literally take in the thing. I can't take the table and put it in my head. But the table gives me data. The data is sensation. What he's calling the brownness of the table, its texture, its temperature, its taste if I were to lick it, its sound if I were to knock it, he's calling that empirical intuition. Okay? And intuition is just the way in which anything presents itself in our mind. We take in information, like our CD-ROM drive of the mind is sensibility. That's the port in which the data is input. Okay? Now, the thing about inputting data is that the data has to be given in a particular kind of form. And the form, again, is intuition. Right? It's the only way that sensibility can read that data. Right? Because you don't put in, cassette tapes into the CD-ROM drive because it ain't going to read it. So it has to be given in a particular kind of form. Right? Y'all with me so far? Now, Kant raises this important question. And again, I spend a lot of time on this first part, because if you get the first part, then this other stuff's not going to be so bad. Because he follows a similar pattern of reasoning. He's basically saying, look, we're going back to the math question. How is it possible? Because if I successfully, on Kant's behalf, have made the case that you're somewhat persuaded, or at least open to the idea, that mathematics has a non-empirical component. That is, through mathematics, we can amplify our knowledge of, things like numbers and integers and like counting and like all this stuff is possible in a way, ultimately, prior to our experience of certain mathematical notions. We can discover these things on our own. Mathematics is an example of the amplification of knowledge without experience. We have to ask the question, how is that possible? Well, Kant's going to say, in a way that mirrors an empiricist claim, but he has just now really broke this down in a very specific sense, all knowledge begins in some kind of intuition. That's Kant's way of saying knowledge has to come from somewhere. It has to come from something in the mind. But the question is, what is it? Now, notice how Kant's not making use of anything like an innate idea. Kant is basically rejecting that kind of thinking. He takes it for granted that Hume has sufficiently shown that like innatism is just dumb. He doesn't even engage with it. So, but he does say that if mathematics has a non-empirical origin, and it's the case that all knowledge has to come from some kind of intuition, aka something that is present to and given to the mind through sensibility, then what is the origin of mathematics. What is mathematics based upon? In the mind, if its origin is non-empirical, aka not through external sense. The only answer is that its origin comes from a pure intuition. So again, Kant has created this kind of, let's call it a dichotomy or a dualism, right? Empirical intuition, objects of sensation. Pure intuition, just take pure to mean non-empirical. AKA, another way to think about it, which means prior to experience. So a priori. I'm sure that's small for the video people, but that's a priori, right? That word. Pure is a priori, aka prior to experience. So there must be something in the mind prior to experience to explain pure mathematical judgments, which are synthetic, real, amplified knowledge prior to experience. What would a pure intuition be, though? What would a pure intuition be? It would be that which is present to the mind when we abstract away all its empirical contents. Kant's going to say, well, then the a priori pure intuitions must be the form of the mental faculty of sensibility itself. To use a kind of a crude analogy, look, it's sort of like the mind's like a computer processor. The data is whatever you're putting into the, the drive or the thumb drive, your USB drive or your CD-ROM drive, and the computer is processing that information. But to be able to perceive that information, right, it has to be given in some kind of medium, right? The medium would be like, I don't know, your screen, right? Now, if I take away all data, right, I'm left only with like the screen itself, right, or the raw computing components that ultimately render my data to be intelligible. Kant's basically saying, what would be like the form or the nature of the mind, its capacity to receive information, absent any empirical components? Kant says if you think away all else, the only thing that you're left with, or the only thing that you're left with as the form of the mental capacity of sensibility itself, are the pure intuitions of time and space. And we talked about this last time, Alexis, but I'm just kind of reiterating it. Hopefully it's not overly redundant. I hope it's helpful. But time, again, it might be tempting to think that time is this objective thing that is out there. But do you ever really learn time? Is there ever a sense in which, is time something you sense in the way that you sense color? It's almost like time precedes all sensation, doesn't it? We might even say that time is like a condition for the possibility of being able to experience anything whatsoever. Because imagine if the world weren't given to us in a sequentially ordered time or chronological structure. What kind of world would that be? We can't imagine it because we can't think outside of time. But Kant says, why is that? If time were something out there we had to learn about, in a way, our mind would be kind of divorced from it. But we can't say that our mind is divorced from time because I can't think outside of time. There's a reason you can't think outside of time. Because your consciousness is literally predicated on the nature of time itself. Time is part of the very structure of your mind. Time is the condition for the possibility of having any experience whatsoever. It exists a priori within the mind because time and space are the form of sensibility. Empirical intuition, aka sense data, is the content. That form is like the matrix through which, not like the matrix, right? But I mean like the matrix through which we interpret all sense data. objects are given through the medium of space and time. Therefore, time and space exist within the mind. And they actually unify and structure unintelligible sense data in order to make it intelligible for us. So time and space exists as pure intuitions, not empirical, because empirical intuition is sensation. Pure intuition is something that is wholly a priori and is literally the form or structure of sensibility itself. And they are the condition for the possibility of having any experience of anything whatsoever. That's why you can't think outside of time and space, because your thinking is molded by time and space, because it only exists in your mind as like a rule for thinking. Your mind plays a constitutive role in the very experiencing and structuring of reality itself. Of course, what's the implication here? Time and space do not have an independent existence apart from the mind. They literally exist within the mind. But also, if it's the case that I can't think outside of time and space, would it be possible to be able to cognize or think about things in themselves? AKA, would it be possible to conceive of a mind-independent reality? To think outside of time and space? It's not possible. So what do you think that says about the metaphysical things? Because that would be to imagine a reality that is apart from the world that we experience, that is structured by time and space, which only exists within the mind itself. Again, the Copernican turn for Kant is this notion that the mind plays this subjective role in actually making our experience of reality possible, which makes it impossible to cognize things outside of human experience, because human experience is the only way that we can represent notions to ourselves. Not simply because of the empiricist, all knowledge, comes from experience, but our experience of that knowledge is formed in part by human thought. That makes it possible and intelligible for us. Importantly, Kant is drawing this line here. Between what he calls phenomena on the one hand and noumena on the other hand. Okay? Phenomena is, of course, the world of experience. But Kant has fundamentally redefined what experience is now. What is experience for Kant? Well, of course, it involves empirical intuition. But what else does it involve? The necessary a priori elements that exist within the mind that make our experience of the world possible. Human experience is like a conjunction or a synthesis of two necessary elements. On the one hand, it is obviously empirical data, sensation, the world that we experience, right? It's the sense data that comes in. But on the other hand, it is the aspects in the mind a priori that structure and organize that experience in order to make it possible for us. Thought, or the mind, needs sensation in order to yield any kind of cognition or truth about the world or about anything at all. But also, sensation needs the mental aspects, categories, intuitions, the a priori intuitions and concepts in order to make sense and organize and structure to make sense of the sense data. Thought needs content, sensation needs thought or concepts. As Kant says, neither of these properties is to be preferred to one another. Without sensibility, no object would be given to us, and without understanding, none would be thought. Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind. Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind. How could we relate this to Kant's response to the debate between rationalism and empiricism with regard to models of or theories of knowledge? The rationalists hold that all knowledge comes from a priori innate ideas. The empiricists hold that the mind is in fact a blank slate, a tabula rasa, and so all knowledge must necessarily come from experience or sensation. Kant holds that there are a priori elements that exist within the mind. It's not a blank slate. There are certain preconditions that exist within the mind in order to make knowledge possible. That is Kant's concession to the rationalists. His a priori elements are going to be the pure intuitions of space and time and the pure concepts of the understanding, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. However, and this is an important point, for the rationalists, innate ideas are sufficient of themselves to be able to tell us something about the nature of mind-independent reality, about God, soul, immortality, etc., and so on. Kant's pure intuitions and concepts that exist only in the mind tell us nothing about things in themselves or a mind-independent reality. So what is the use of the pure concepts and the pure intuition? Their use is only with regard to experience in order to make experience possible. That's his concession to the empiricists. That knowledge only comes from experience. So there are a priori concepts or, quote unquote, innate aspects of the mind, but their role is that of form, not Aristotelian form, a Platonic form. Although it's interesting, well, I'll come back to that in a moment. Their role is that of like a form in the sense of being empty or devoid of any content. The thoughts without content are empty and thus tell us nothing about what Kant calls noumenon, or things in themselves. There's a couple of ways to interpret this. On the one hand, we literally mean mind-independent reality, like what the table looks like, independent of a human perceiver. But also, pneuma, in a more wide, expanded use, refers to the objects of metaphysics, the things that we can never experience. So again, the a priori intuitions, space and time, as well as the pure concepts of the understanding, which I'm about to talk about next, their role is only for the structure and organizing of experience. They can never have applicability to things in themselves. So can we ever conceive of or know of a mind-independent reality? It's impossible, because it would be like saying, can you think outside of time? But it's also interesting that Kant's answer to the question of why we can't think outside of time is because time exists only in our mind and is the necessary filter through which we think about everything. That's a kind of a mind-blowing, I mean, if you really wrap your head around what Kant is saying, I think it has some intuitive sense about it. And it starts to really make you think about, well, you know, the relationship of the mind to reality. But anyway, so here's a simple answer. You like simple answers? How is pure mathematics possible? What's the answer? Space and time. But not just space and time as we normally think about it, but the pure intuitions. And of course, what do I mean by pure? Non-empirical. Intuition, present in the mind, which are the conditions for possible experience. By the way, let's specifically talk about the connection between math and geometry and time and space, respectively. Why is mathematics capable of rendering synthetic a priori judgments? Because mathematics is nothing more than the schematization of time itself. Math is predicated upon the interval chronological nature of time and is reflected by the very act of counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, just like the ticking of the clock. What is geometry other than the schematization of space? But in its pure element, I don't need to experience things to do geometry. I need only my pure intuition of space. Last point, and this is actually pretty neat. Why is it the case that I can interpret all of the physical world mathematically and geometrically? If the world, insofar as my sense data of the external world is given through the form of space and time, and space and time can be rendered both in an arithmetic and geometrical sense, then it makes sense. If I can schematize time and space mathematically, then I necessarily can schematize the world mathematically, because the world is given to me through the form existing in my mind of space and time. It works out pretty well. But moving on, Kant says it's not merely the case that we intuit or sense the world, but we think about the world. And this is the second level of human mental capacities, the level of the understanding, which now is that by which objects are thought. We don't merely take in sense data, but we, maybe the best way I can put it, conceptualize it, right? Look, I don't take the world in, contrary to Hume, as a bundle of impressions. The world that I see, analogous to what I was talking about the mathematical geometrical nature of the world that I experience, it is schematized. If I couldn't rise to be beyond the level of intuition, then this thing would be nothing more than a bundle of green, smooth, and black. It would just be an unintelligible barrage of sensation. As a matter of fact, the very language that I'm using to communicate these notions to you, green, smooth, and black, rise beyond the level of intuition, because I would have to conceptualize the nature of smoothness, greenness, and blackness in order to form a universal notion through which I can communicate something that is green, because something that is, the word green applies to all greens, but no green in particular. If I didn't have conceptual thinking, then my description of this thing to you would just be something like, no words, no language could express it, because, you know, my gesturing would just mirror the unintelligible laws of sensibility that is, you know, presenting itself to me. But in fact, I can say, This is a mug. It's almost like my mind took all that sensation that's fluttering in, unified it, organized it, abstracted from its immediacy to say that is a mug. It fits into the category of mug things. Mug things involve pretty much all mugs that we can, think about as mugs, but not in particular mug. It is a way of thinking. It is a way of organizing our empirical sense data in order to make it intelligible for us. It's one thing to say that sensation is given through the medium of time and space, but that sensation is then taken up and organized. And it is done, that is done through what Kant calls concepts. One thing to sense the world, it's another thing to think about the world. Concepts also have an empirical and pure element. Oh, are you starting to see the pattern here? Again, I know the Kant is pretty wild. That's one reason I like to teach it. But again, once you can see the pattern of his analysis, it really starts to become simple. And that's the point of the graph, is to kind of show you this pattern of analysis. What would be an empirical concept? Huh? Mm-hmm. Model? That's a concept. What about, well, blue again, but now I put brackets. Brackets these concepts. What's the difference between, I kind of already alluded to this, but just to make absolutely clear, what's the difference between intuition blue and concept blue? What's the difference there? Don't know? Nobody knows? Very good. It's like the word blue, our understanding of blue. Because, if you didn't see he had a blue shirt, and I just went over to you and I said, he's got a blue shirt, in your mind, you can conceive of what that is, but it could be sky blue, it could be navy blue, because the concept blue is like the category that embraces all blue things, but signifies no particular blue. It's just a universal notion. It is a way that you conceptually organize your immediate experience of things. And by the way, notice how important, I've been kind of subtly stressing this, the importance of concepts for communication. Words are basically predicated upon the ability of the mind's, they're predicated upon the mind's ability to form concepts. We abstract from particulars to form universals in order to communicate what things are, right? But the only way that we can abstract and form concepts is by taking in this sensation, and forming a kind of a rule about it. All mug things must possess these particular qualities, right? Just to mention one more thing, the German word Begriff is the word that's translated into concept. So this is just the word for concept in German. But I highlight this because it comes from griffe, which is to grasp something. And I like the etymology here, that is, the word origin, because Kant sees concepts as literally that which grasps, that is, takes up otherwise a barrage of sensation and unifies it and gives it a structure, an order, and a meaning. That's the way that Kant thinks of concepts. But these are pretty simple. Concepts can get pretty sophisticated too. Inertia is a concept. So is gravity. Also, rules that make intelligible our understanding of phenomena. right? Laws of nature. Kant is arguing that natural science also has non-empirical elements to it. Now, I know that seems strange because we would typically think of science as almost entirely empirical. What's Kant getting at here? When we think about experience, though, you got to think about Hume again, because remember, Kant is responding to Hume. What he's saying is, in relation to pure natural science, the synthetic judgment a priori element to it, he's saying causation is not found within experience. What do you mean it's not within experience? Well, what do we perceive in experience? If we don't see causation, what do we perceive? Well, what does Hume say that we perceive? We don't see causal connection. We see constant conjunction. We see A occurs, B occurs. Cue ball moves, stops against the 8 ball moves. Do you see in your show? Do you see the force that governs these actions? Do you see causality? Causality is like really abstract. Like the more that you break it down, the more you realize causality is a very abstract notion. You only see two distinct phenomenal occurrences that are linked together in time, and you also see them repetitiously. Now, Hume will say, therefore, causation must be nothing more than habit. But see, Kant doesn't follow Hume on this. Notice how he agrees that causality indeed is non-empirical, but he doesn't reduce causality to mere habit, custom, belief, and just a subjective association that we make up. He doesn't come to the skeptical conclusion. Kant's going to say, it is a pure concept of the understanding that makes experience possible for us. AKA, Hume is correct to say that causation isn't found within experience. But in fact, it exists within the mind as an a priori concept that makes experience possible by structuring and organizing that experience to give it some kind of unity and intelligibility for us. Now, Kant's entire argument for the elaboration and justification of what he calls his table of categories, all the concepts prior to experience, of which I do not expect you to memorize, only to just understand what they are and their function. And I want to highlight two in particular, maybe three, but really two in particular. I'm not going to go through the entirety of this argument because that would take a few days. Honestly, it constitutes a large part of this mammoth masterwork, which is why in the Prolegomena, basically I'm referring now to the second part here. And the only reason I'm not drawing more so from the text is because, look, I mean, we could talk about Kant quotes all day, but as we know, Kant's very difficult to read, so I would rather give you the big picture, but I do want you to look at the text, and hopefully you can make a connection between some of the things that Kant is saying and what we're elaborating here. But again, Kant is taking up natural science in part 2, and of course that yields the discussion of the human understanding, which is how the human understanding, through the use of pure a priori concepts, structures and organizes experience in order to make it possible for us. So the more complete picture that we're seeing is that Kant is saying that our experience of reality is based upon the pure intuitions of space and time, which are the form of the mental faculty of sensibility, in conjunction with pure concepts of the understanding that impose order, form, and schema onto our sense data in order to give it structure, regularity, and to yield cognition, aka knowledge about the world. Kant avoids the skepticism of Hume by saying that the necessity and order of nature is not based upon something that is independent of the mind. The necessity that we find within nature that Hume denies, or at least denies knowledge of, is not found in nature. The necessity and order of nature is a result of the ordering capacities of human mind. As a bit of evidence for this, I will draw from the text here because Kant puts things quite plainly. On page 58 of the Prolegomena in the second part, he even puts it in italics. I guess it was important. He says there, 3 lines in, it seems at first strange. If a philosopher is basically prefacing this by saying, get ready, then it will be. If it seems at first, it seems at first strange, but it is not the less certain to say the understanding does not derive its laws a priori from, but prescribes them to nature. Looking back on page 57, a little bit of explanation. First full paragraph on 57. Even the main proposition expounded throughout this section, that universal laws of nature can be cognized a priori, leads itself to the proposition that, here we go, hold on to your butts, the highest legislation of nature must lie in ourselves, that is, in our understanding, and that we must not seek the universal laws of nature in nature by means of experience, but must conversely seek nature as to its universal conformity to law in the conditions of the possibility of experience, which lie in our sensibility and our understanding. So what is Kant saying here? If you can answer that question, then you're on the way. The highest legislation is not found in nature. Legislation of nature. The legislation of nature, legislation is law. The laws of nature are not discerned from nature. They are discerned within the mind. The order and regularity of nature is based upon the mind structure and organizing of nature. Now that's a big claim. That is a big claim. Can we flesh it out? Well, give me some space here. And again, this is found on your pages of the Prolegomena, 42 through 43. I do have this all up in a PowerPoint, but you know, I kind of like drawing things. PowerPoints, you know, they have their use, but you can't beat the board. All right, but anyway, so this is in answer to the second question. How is your natural science possible? The answer to that is, let me do it this way. The pure concept of the understanding. If something is pure for Kant, that means it is non-empirical, aka it is a priori, aka it exists only within the mind, but for the purposes of application to experience, not to things in themselves or noumena, aka God, freedom, immortality, mind, independent reality. Kant has a nice little table here, organized into 4 sections. I'm sorry for people at home. I know that this is probably hard to look at, especially because my board is getting smeary. But if you want to follow along, page 43 of the Prolegomena outlines this specifically. I'm sure that on an electronic copy, it's probably in there too. Okay? Oh, wait, you go through this glove? It's okay. I've given up too. Quality, reality, negation, limitation. I'm doing this diamond-like structure because this is the way that carpenters it in the big book. Whew, there you go. What Kant is basically saying is that there exists a priori or within, it is literally the very structure of human understanding, existing as the very structure of human understanding, which again rises beyond merely taking in sense data. Animals do that, right? But we process it. We make rules about it. What exemplifies our rule-governed approach to the empirical world that we encounter? Why, natural science, of course, right? But given that we do not perceive necessity within experience, thanks to Hume's important observations, and yet at the same time, we believe that natural science is giving us some sort of actual knowledge of the necessary structure of nature, how is it possible that there is necessity if it is not to be found within experience? We must go beyond experience, synthetic judgment a priori. And what Kant discerns is that, again, within the mind itself exist these concepts. Now, importantly, the best way to understand how Kant is interpreting these pure concepts is that they are like rules. They are rules for thinking that mind imposes on to empirical intuition in order to give it structure, in order to make it intelligible. They are the preconditions for possible experience. Let me try to talk through it. Here's this. At the end of the day, the mind is a pretty fascinating thing. Think about how much empirical intuition you're taking in right now. Sounds, smells, the feeling of the chair on your butt, the table on your hands, the colors of the white, all these different things. Yet your mind can filter out all that and fixate upon one particular object. And it takes the variety of sensation, and the very first thing is that it unifies it. It turns many things, black, smooth, cool, green, into one thing. Once you're able to cognize one thing, you can therefore, if you make an integer, notice how quantity relates to mathematics. You got two things. I've unified one thing, and now I got two things. But if I got two things, I now have a totality of things. I also can conceive that this thing exists. I could also say maybe it doesn't exist. But there is where it exists, and there's where it stops existing. Therefore, that's the concept of limitation that allows me to differentiate between this thing and where it ends. This particular thing is a substance. A substance that has so many properties of white and black and smooth and all and rough at the same time. It's so many different things, and yet my mind unifies the variety of intuitions into one thing that permeates consistently through time, but also has a definitive shape within space. The point is that substance is not this aspect of reality that the mind has to penetrate into, like what Aristotle thought, like what Descartes thought. Rather, substance is an a priori concept that exists within the mind in order to make our experience of reality possible. We perceive of the world as a totality of individual substances, unified and permeating through time within space. This is all the product of the mind's cognizing and imposing order onto otherwise a plethora of sensation. Kant's response to Hume's problem, now it's time to go, but of course I'll come back to this. The necessity of causal connections is possible, and thereby natural science is possible, because the nature of causality isn't a mysterious something I know not what that exists in a mind-independent reality, but causation is a pure concept that imposes an order and structure onto our experience and makes it possible. Causal associations are necessary because we can never perceive the world outside of causality, because empirical intuition is given through the pure concept of causation, which grabs or takes up that intuition and imposes a structure upon it. Of course, that means that the laws of nature at the end of the day, for Kant, are not to be found within nature, but are legislated by the mind itself. Final point, reality thus is mind-dependent for Kant. To conceive of a mind-independent reality is an impossibility. Again, his word for that, noumena. Things in themselves. Can we ever know such a thing? Well, can you think outside of time, space, and causality? Of course you can. So he deals the death blow to metaphysics, but what does he salvage? Unlike Hume, he salvages the importance of human thought, the importance of, or he reestablishes necessity, but the irony is that necessity is not an objective structure of reality, but it's a subjective structure imposed onto our experience of reality in order to make it possible for us. Does all that make sense? Good. You're nodding your head. You are just like, I'm not sure. Well, ride the waves, my friend. You only got about 3 more weeks. So, all right. I'll see y'all next time. I guess there's only one final question. What in the world is reason? That'll be our topic. Well, the Kant's just going to say it gets in the way. It has problems. Actually, all the problems of metaphysics are resolved. Basically, he said that human beings are just the kind of creatures that the objects of experience is never going to be enough for us. So every time that there's an answer given to us in science, we have to say the problem. And that's what reason does. And that's why we have metaphysics. But anyway, the readings for Tuesday are on Blackboard. We are supposed to start Nietzsche. I anticipate that we're going to spend a little bit more time to finish up Kant, but for the reading question purposes and for the purposes of coming to class on Tuesday, just go ahead and do the reading of Nietzsche, all right? And maybe I'll only spend half the class on Kant, but I'll spend as much time as I feel like I need to make sure that everybody is following. I haven't seen the Tuesday people in 2 weeks, so we're gonna have to see how they are. But anyways, thank you very much. Hey. Mm-hmm.